bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, I did what many others did, hundreds and thousands of us did. We went down December 8th and volunteered for service. Because of the influx of volunteers, they had no place to put any of us, so it took them a month or two before they built some camps in order to handle us. They finally gave me orders to report to a Camp Sutton, North Carolina, which was a camp that was sprung out of a swamp, more or less. The owners of the land had given the land to the government for $1 plus whatever improvements that they could make on it. They drained the swamp for him and everything. And we didn't have any uniforms at all when we reported at the camp, so we drilled in our clothes, whatever we wore when we reported for duty, for about 3 weeks, and then they finally gave us shoes to wear. And when they gave us the shoes, they immediately took us out on a little walk of 25 miles to break in the shoes. 90% of the young men in that group did not finish that walk because the shoes were so stiff. We all had blisters on our feet. They transferred me from Camp Sutton, North Carolina to Camp Perry, Ohio. And that camp was, and probably still is, owned by the NRA. And our duties at Camp Perry, Ohio were to test powders that were going to be used for the shells, heavy shells that they were going to use in artillery. And we would fire shells out over Lake Erie. And from Camp Perry, Ohio, they selected some of us to be the cadre to help form the 9th Armored Division in Fort Riley, Kansas. When I arrived at Fort Riley, Kansas, most of the officer personnel were still thinking in terms of General Pershing and how he fought a war. We were supposed to convert the 7th Cavalry, horse cavalry, into tanks. And those regular Army horsemen were not going to get into those bucket of bolts, as they called them. I noticed certain things that occurred in the camp, that most of the officer personnel, regular Army personnel, had no concept of what the modern day warfare was going to be all about. The type of movement, the movement of supplies to troops as they were moving. In those years, the service academies did not teach very much on the art of logistics. I ended up in the Ordnance Department at Fort Riley, Kansas, and I immediately noticed something else that was very strange, was that I'd say 90% of the officer personnel in the Ordnance Division received direct commissions from civilian life, or, as I had turned out, I came up from the ranks through officer candidate school. So we had less than 10% of the officer personnel in the Ordnance Division in World War II that had received commissions from a military school of some sort. I took advantage of that situation because the officers that received direct commissions were used to corporate structure. Every time they had to do something, they had to call a meeting. In the meantime, war was going on while they were having staff meetings. Many of the officer personnel at Fort Riley, Kansas still wore the flat-brim trader hats, riding breeches, boots, and carried that riding crop under their left arm. That's how indoctrinated they were into modern warfare. After we had the 7th Cavalry broken into those rust buckets, which were terrible tanks, we went on maneuvers immediately east of Fort Riley, Kansas, in a place called Funston Flats. Now, Funston Flats actually was a shallow river with swampy land on both sides of the river, and the plans were for a unit, or a couple of units that ford the river in rubber boats, to set up a perimeter on the other side of the river. In the meantime, the combat engineers would build a pontoon bridge across the river, and then the tanks would cross from the west side of the river to the east side to continue their maneuvers. The bridge was built, and the first 3 tanks went onto the bridge, and when the first tank got into the middle of the bridge, the pontoon bridge broke apart and tanks sank down into the water. Fortunately, it was a shallow river, so the crew escaped from their tanks all right. Meantime, tanks were breaking down mechanically all across the west side of the river, and maintenance men were trying to revive and get the tanks going again. And I just stood there. By this time I was a corporal, and I just stood there and I said in a voice, "This is the most stupid thing I've ever seen in my life." Immediately a foghorn voice behind me said, "Corporal, what's so stupid about what's going on here?" And I turned around, it was a full colonel. I just froze in place. I mean, I froze solid. And he immediately turned around and walked away. The very next day I was ordered into his office. And I came into his office, I froze again, just solid. And he had a voice like a foghorn. And he said, "I asked you a question yesterday, Corporal, and I want an answer right now." So I replied, I said, "Sir, if this would have been actual combat conditions, all of us would have been killed. How can we take these terrible tanks that are breaking down mechanically and try to get them usable and moving under extreme combat conditions? It'd be physically impossible." So he asked me what I would do. I said, "Well, very simple, sir. I think I would have engines ready to replace the engines of the tanks, no matter what caused them to break down. Yank the engines out of the tanks, put the rebuilt engines or new engines back in the tanks and get going. We're under fire." So he asked me where I would get all these rebuilt engines. I said, "Well, set up assembly lines where in the rear echelon. Take these engines that broke down and rebuild them as if you're building a new engine." So he said, "Get the hell out of my office." A few days later he called me back into his office and he said, "Sergeant, what OCS are you going to?" And I said, "Excuse me, sir, Corporal." I pointed to the 2 stripes on my sleeve. He said, "I said sergeant." I received a promotion, didn't know about it. So then he said, "What OCS are you going to?" And I said, "Excuse me, sir, what is OCS?" I had no idea what he was talking about. And he told me it was Officer Candidate School. I said, "Well, sir, then I want to go to armor." Well, he said, "You have to make 3 selections." I said, "All right, sir, I want to go to armor, field artillery, and signal corps." He said, "You're going to ordnance." I said, "Sir, if you had your mind made up as to where I'm going, why did you ask me where I wanted to go?" He said, "Because Army regulations stipulate you have to make 3 choices. You're going to ordnance." Well, a couple of weeks later, there I was, Aberdeen, Maryland, Officer Candidate School, and out of the 160 of us that were in the class, only about 120 survived. It's impossible to create an officer in 90 days, but what they were trying to find out is if we had the nerve to stand up under adverse conditions. And they made it conditions as difficult as they possibly could. For example, someone would sneak up behind us while we were out in the field and fire a .45 right close to our head, right behind us. Several of our people broke down when that occurred, and they were booted out. Fortunately, I survived, and I received my commission as a 2nd lieutenant. And when they lined us up to give us our commission, they called each name out and immediately handed those that were receiving their commissions their assignment. I was the only one that did not get an assignment. And they dismissed us. And I just stood there. So I finally walked up to the officer command headquarters and as I walked in, there was a captain sitting at a desk, and he looked up, he said, "You're Nemerov, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I suppose you're wondering why you received no assignment." I said, "No, yes, sir, I'm very curious." He said, "Well, we're going to make you prove your big mouth." Just like that. I said, "Excuse me, sir," I said, "I don't get the drift." He said, "We're going to send you someplace and make you prove that you can rebuild engines in the rear echelon." So they sent me down to Atlanta, Georgia, and I was picked up by a sergeant at the train depot and driven out about 10 miles outside of Atlanta to a place called Candler Warehouse. And I was told I had to build assembly lines in that Candler Warehouse and start rebuilding engines. Well, I had no idea where I was going to get anything to build a line with. I had no idea where I would get personnel. So I commandeered a Jeep and drove to Camp McPherson, excuse me, which was just a few miles away. And I found that I would have to select GI personnel coming into the service by interviewing them and then scrounge for materials to build this assembly line. Well, Camp McPherson was a large incoming depot, and it had many, many warehouses in there with these big roller-type blades on stands, steel stands, where they could roll heavy cases in from the trucks that are bringing them in, bringing materials in, and move the heavy equipment into the warehouses. So I lined up my men at night, and we went and borrowed all these steel rollers that we could find from these warehouses, put them in trucks, took them out to Candler Warehouse, and we built assembly lines. It caused a little furor because people want to know what happened to their rollers. I was the culprit. I admitted it. I had the line built in the Candler Warehouse, and we started to rebuild engines, and we were turning them out as fast as we possibly could, and it was very successful. So they sent me out to Pomona, California to create assembly lines, because the engines of rolling equipment was being chewed up by the sand of the Arizona-California maneuver area, headquartered out of Indio, California. So we were stripping the engines down, cleaning them up, and rebuilding everything on the engine there. We built 4 big lines in Pomona, California, and I was hired about 2,000 women to work the line. And they were very enthusiastic, and they're very cooperative, and they did an excellent job, especially on the fine things that had to be rebuilt, like carburetors, distributors, fuel pumps, small things. They learned very quickly. Then I was sent over from there to Salisbury Plains in England to build assembly lines to prepare for the invasion. About 3 weeks before I was transferred to Salisbury Plains, we had a change in our executive officer, a major by the name of Smiley, Major Smiley. And when we finally landed at Salisbury Plains, he wanted to meet each individual officer in the outfit and interview them himself. He received a direct commission as a major because his wife was the niece of General Lee, who was chief of ordnance European theater. Major Smiley was about 6'4", a big beefy person, and when it came time for my interview, he looked up at me and he said, "I want to make something very clear to you. I don't like 90-day wonders, and I don't like Jews." So I had 2 strikes against me with this very fine person. Well, after I got the assembly lines built in Salisbury Plains and got them going, he removed me from the assembly lines and sent me out on detached duty with the British Amphibious Forces at Bideford, England, where we were working out on invasion maneuvers. My responsibility was to figure out a way to get rolling equipment off of landing craft through the water up onto shore, ready for use in an invasion. We would experiment with different types of substances to seal off all the entrances to the engines itself. And we would take the units that were being waterproofed on landing craft out into the ocean, and then turn the landing craft around, drop the ramp, and take the equipment off the landing craft into the water, and you try to get it up on shore. And we finally hit upon a substance very much like Play-Doh that was made by Minnesota Mining, which was the most effective of all the substances that we experimented with. Then we finally came back, and we were training those units that were earmarked for the invasion on how to waterproof their equipment. After we got that started, I went back to Salisbury Plains, and the first thing Major Smiley did was to call me in and tell me in very graphic language how big a failure my assembly line was, that things weren't coming through, and he was going to put me back in charge of the assembly line. I could read his mind. By this time I was a first lieutenant. I could read his mind, and then he was going to show that I was incompetent and try to bust me back to the ranks. Well, I went into the assembly lines, and the ones that I had built were about 2.5 blocks long on cement slabs, and we put big Quonset huts over them to have the covers on the assembly lines. And I found out rather quickly what the problems were. I corrected them and really started to get equipment rolling through. We were assembling Jeeps, half-tracks, 3/4-ton weapons carriers, 6x6 trucks, bomb carriers. The bomb carriers were really cabs that would haul the flats that would carry bombs to the planes, to load the planes with the bombs. We were also assembling M8 and M20 armored cars. And I started to turn the equipment out as fast as we possibly could. Major Smiley insisted on inspecting the assembly line, and whenever he would come in, he would ride through the assembly line in a Jeep because he couldn't walk the 2.5 blocks that were the assembly lines were built on. And unfortunately, I had to, every time he would come in, I'd have to separate parts bins so he could get through. Well, he came through this time, and he always addressed me as, "Hey, you." He never addressed me by name or by ranks. I was, "Hey, you." And by this time, I had him well over my head. He came in this time, I separated the parts bins, and he stood up in the Jeep and yelled for, "Hey, you." And I came over. You can imagine I'm 5'9", 5'10", and he's 6'4", standing in the Jeep, and I have to stand and salute him. And I'm looking up like this, saluting him. And he said in a very surly tone, "You are doing your job. What do you say we call a truce?" I said, "Yes, sir. You stay the hell away from me, and I'll stay the hell away from you." And he said, "Hey, you, I ought to knock your block off." And he stepped out of the Jeep. Next thing I knew, they took him to the hospital. I just pulverized him. Oh, yeah.
Ooh, good for you. God.
I didn't hit him in the face because he was too tall. I hit him about 5 or 6 times right in the belly, and he doubled over, and he was out on his feet, and I didn't know it. And as he came forward, I hit him in the back of the head. Down he went face first into the cement floor. He ended up with a broken cheekbone, a broken jaw, a broken nose. In the hospital. I was immediately put under arrest. Court-martial had to be convened. And here we are preparing for the invasion. I was very fortunate that they assigned an investigating officer who was the post chaplain, which was most unusual, Captain Nelson. And Captain Nelson came in to see me in the tent that they had put up in the middle of the field with the guard in the front, the guard in the, our guard in the back. I was a dangerous criminal, I guess. He came in to see me and he said, Jack, he said, everybody knew what was going on. All we were waiting for was for you to come up to headquarters and file a complaint. And I said, this was very, very personal, Captain. I appreciate what you're doing, but I had to take care of it myself. And he said, you certainly did. And he told me about the damage that Major Spotty has sustained. Well, Captain Nelson came back a few days later and he said, nobody really wants to court-martial you under the circumstances. He said, but you struck a superior officer. And he said, we're trying to make a deal. You'll be put down at the bottom of the promotion list. I said, that's okay with me. This is not a career for me. When the war's over, I'm going home as a civilian. He said, and you just volunteered for the invasion. Well, I said, well, that will solve the problems, won't it? You'll get me knocked off and that's the end of the story. Well, they classified me as an observer for the invasion, and I went in, I hit Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, about 6:30 in the morning, in the first wave. I came in with elements of the 29th Infantry Headquarters Company, just below the area where we could see this sandy cliff-like hill called Pont du Hoc. If any of you have seen the film Saving Private Ryan, that was one of the featured parts of the early part of the film that had to be taken out because the German gunners on top of Pont du Hoc had a very commanding field of fire over Utah Beach and over Omaha Beach, so that they had to be taken out. That was taken out by the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions. This is where I parked somewhat with what was shown on the film, Saving Private Ryan. And I'm not critical of the film itself because it was very depictive of the horrors of war. But anyone that makes a film of war would have to interview hundreds of us that survived, and no two of us would have the same viewpoint of what was going on. There's no way we could lift up our head and take a panoramic view of what was going on in an invasion, because if we did that, we'd get our heads blown off. So all we knew was what was going on a little bit to our right, a little bit to our left, and right in front of us. I could see the attack on Pont du Hoc. The film showed that the attack came from the left side of the hill, which was incorrect. The attack came from directly in front. The 2nd Ranger Battalion came in with explosive canisters, and they would set them off, and the canisters would blow grappling hooks up into the air. The grappling hook was like an anchor. Each grappling hook had a heavy rope attached to it. When the grappling hooks would hit on top, they would yank on the ropes to firmly embed the grappling hook, and then they scaled the hill from the front, not the side, as the movie showed. And the reason behind that was that the German gunners up on top, in order to repel the attack, would have to stand up to fire downhill. The ones on the left of the hill were sharpshooters who were assigned to the responsibility of knocking off these German gunners as they stood up. There were other little things. I wasn't the only one that pointed out some of the differences about the actuality of what occurred on the invasion that were a little different than what the film actually showed. But as I mentioned before, the film was very depictive of the terribleness of war, the costliness of war. We had no idea at that time if we would ever have to mount an invasion of this type again during the war. Therefore, they had certain observers on the beach, like myself, who was supposed to observe the value of waterproofing to get equipment up on through the water up on the shore. Not a single piece of equipment made it through the water. Not one. And we had desperate need for equipment on the shore, especially for tanks, because they were moving artillery, and we needed artillery there to protect us. Not a tank made it through the water, not one. One of the craft that held 2 tanks on it out in the water, the crew of the front tank thought they would try to help us, and they fired off 2 rounds from off the craft. Now you can imagine trying to zero in on a target on a craft that's moving on the water, both sideways and front and back. Those 2 shells landed closer to us than they landed to the Germans, so we had to wave them off because they were going to land their shells on us. The heavy fire that we were receiving from the German defense positions out of the pillboxes was very intense. The only way the pillboxes could be taken out, because we had nothing in our arsenals in those years that could penetrate the structures. The tops of the pillboxes were as much as 8 feet thick of cement and steel. And the only way to take them out was to get up close with flamethrowers and hand grenades. A very costly way to take them out, but it had to be done that way. Well, we finally held on to the beach, Omaha Beach. It took 6 hours of heavy fighting on the beach to secure it. We did not start to penetrate any of our units until about 12:30, 1 o'clock, and we landed at 6:30 in the morning. Those of us that had a command position, as I did, I was responsible for a fine group of young men, were told that if we could not hold the beach and get out of there, well, that posed quite some serious problems as far as I was concerned, because the drivers of the landing craft dumped us off in deep water, anywhere from our waist to our chest. And the minute they dumped us off, they pulled their landing craft way back. So getting back to our landing craft would have been physically impossible. So I had things to think about if we could not hold the beach. We knew what the Germans were doing with the Jewish population. I'm in charge of a group of fine young men. How do I abandon them if we cannot hold the beach? Do I surrender to the Germans? That was something that I couldn't contemplate doing because I was Jewish. Do I commit suicide? Or do I make some attempt to swim back to a landing craft? Well, I didn't have to make any decision because we held the beach and we started to penetrate. So I was saved by that. In the first 15 minutes of our invasion, we had 5,000 casualties. Out of the 5,000, most of those casualties were not shot, they were drowned. It was very unfortunate. In making of the movies, the scene of bodies floating in the water was deleted. It was classified as top secret, although those films are still active and still held as top secret by the Defense Department, and every once in a while someone will come through with some of those films, and I've seen them twice now at Luke Air Force Base. They also have films of terrible sights that occurred in Pearl Harbor in the bombing, like sailors jumping off their sinking ships into burning oil on water. Horrible sights. Those films are also held as top secret. At the time that I went in on the invasion, I was in General Bradley's staff of the First Army. And as we progressed, I was called back to Bournemouth for debriefing. And during the debriefing services, it wasn't for the purpose of criticizing anything that we did, but for the purpose of gaining information. And at that time, I was not the only one that brought up this issue of who was to be in charge of a landing craft. At that time, the person that was driving the landing craft, who was also identified as a driver, was in charge of his particular craft. And if he said, drop the ramp and go, we have to obey his order. My point was that the senior officer or non-commissioned officer on each landing craft should be in charge, not the driver. Had I been in charge of our craft, as I should have been, as I was the senior officer on our craft, I would have gone to the driver and held a gun to his head and said, either you get us in closer, I'll blow your head off, and I'll take the craft in closer. I was not the only one that made that statement. I understand that that order was changed because many of these landing operations took place in the Pacific Ocean, and I understood that the senior officer on each landing craft was put in charge, not the one that was in charge as the driver. So that must have sank in pretty well with the top brass. I was sent back to the French soil and remained with the forces until we reached Paris. When we reached Paris, I was transferred from General Bradley's staff to General Eisenhower's staff. Now, being at a general staff is no great glory because in order to keep things moving, there has to be thousands of things that have to be taken care of and have to be done. We had determined that we were going to rebuild all of our equipment in France because Congress had passed a law forbidding the return of any equipment from a combat theater back to the United States at the termination of hostilities. And we can just imagine if we had returned, say, 50,000 tanks that weigh 30 tons apiece, that's 50,000 times 30 tons of scrap iron. Our steel industry would have been hurt for years. Or if we had returned 100,000 Jeeps, our automotive industry would be hurt for years. So none of that stuff was going to come back. We were going to rebuild our equipment in the European theater. We took over all the automotive plants in France, and we re-established them to rebuild our equipment. My assignment at that time was to convert the feeder plants into manufacturing the spare parts. Now, the European system in those years was not like the American system, where we had large assembly lines manufacturing spare parts. I was getting a lot of things cast at Charleroi, Belgium, like pistons, piston rings, valves, rings, housings, and anything that's cast comes out of cast with little pimples out of it. They're called burrs, and all that stuff has to be ground off. So I would reestablish all the feeder plants in France. It was not unusual for me to go into a little plant where a French personnel had a couple of grinders on the center of the floor, and he lived either in the back or upstairs, and he could grind all these little pimples off of our valves and rings and so on. The only problem I had was to convert their thinking from their metric system to our decimal system in their allowances on their grinding procedure. And then I would figure out in one place how much this one person could turn out, let's say, in valves in a 30-day period. And I would assign the voucher to make sure he had a 90-day supply. He would take the voucher up to the military government, and he would get paid. I never had to negotiate price. Thank goodness for that, because negotiating with the French was impossible. I was given other various assignments, and incidentally, I reactivated approximately 350 of these little plants to manufacture American parts. General Magruder gave me a special decoration for accomplishing that. One of the assignments I received was to establish priorities as the war was moving closer to Germany into warehouses that contained raw materials. I received excellent information on all these warehouses from the British intelligence, which is far superior to anything that we had. And I would have to rush out and establish priority on warehouses that contained raw metals. Half the time I didn't know if I was behind the active lines, fighting lines, or in front of them, if I was in German territory or whatever. I had to take that chance. One of the assignments I received was to rush down to Munich to take over the BMW plant. The BMW plant was turning out very fine equipment all the way from motorcycles to tanks for the German war machine, and we were going to rebuild our tanks in that plant. So I rushed down there, and I was told that if I needed protection to try to get it from the 42nd Infantry Division, which was operating in that area. I had no problem in getting into the plant to inspect it. And while I was examining the plant, I heard a voice behind me say, "Oh, too bad, too bad." And here's where I kind of digress a bit for a moment when I speak of these experiences in schools, because to this very day I cannot understand the mentality of the German population. Here was a population very well educated, very creative, very progressive. Many of them could speak perfect English. How could that society have done the horrible things that they did? And they did horrible things, and they knew they were doing it. No way can I reconcile that in my mind, how this could have occurred with this type of a society. And I turned around and looked at the person that said, "Oh, too bad, it would happen to be the foreman of the tank plant." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Oh, we didn't know." And when he said that, I reached for my gun. I was ready to shoot him. But then I knew I needed him. So I figured I'd have to educate these people that claim they didn't know. So I commandeered a few 6x6 trucks and put some of the personnel from the tank plant on the trucks. And I had heard about a camp just 10 miles away. So I headed out, and I was the first American convoy into this camp, Dachau, a death camp. At the height of Nazi power, there were approximately 9,000 concentration camps, all the way from northern Italy up to the Ukraine. Out of the 9,000, 300 were classified as termination camps, where they established the ovens to burn up the bodies and the gas chambers. Dachau was a termination camp. When I entered that camp, the first thing that hit me was a horrible odor, terrible odor. All these odors that were mixed together, the lack of sanitation, the odor of blood all over the place, the odor coming out of the ovens of burnt human flesh and bone, all together. It was just as if someone had opened up the bowels of hell and brought out the brimstone odor into this place. How people could say they didn't know what was going on, because when the wind would shift around, that odor would go for miles. They knew. They knew exactly what was going on. The second thing that hit me were the poor walking scarecrows that I saw there. If you can imagine, full-grown men, let's say that the average size in those years was 5'8", 5'9", 150, 160 pounds. Full-grown men that weighed 80 to 90 pounds, barely able to keep on their feet, walking around in these filthy, striped prison uniforms that they wore. They were filthy. And the next thing that hit me was back off to the right. I saw this pile of naked human bodies. Heinrich Himmler had issued orders that all prisoners were supposed to be killed. he specified all prisoners, which included prisoners of war. Most camp commandants did not obey those orders. All they did was throw their gates open and say, "Go." Well, the prisoners of war in these camps knew what's the purpose of going. Another week, another 2 weeks, will be taken over by American forces or Allied forces and freed. The prisoners in the concentration camps were 2 weeks to go any place, even though the gates were opened. Oh, they waited to be liberated. The commandant of Dachau was obeying the orders of Heinrich Himmler and was having prisoners shot. And before most of the prisoners in Dachau were being shot, they had to take their clothes off to further humiliate them. And here's this pile of naked bodies. And to my mind's eye, when I recall this picture, that pile looked as if it was 10 feet high. I'm not saying it was, because I didn't measure it. But when I recall those images, it still looks as if that pile of naked bodies was 10 feet high. They were shooting them faster than they could burn them up. So it has taken me over 50 years to be able to speak about these experiences. And I find that when I go into the schools and talk about these experiences to these young people in our classes, that they do as much for me as I do for them. They supply me with an audience that convert these horrible nightmares into just bad dreams. And when I'm through with the class, I thank them for giving me this therapy, which is exactly what it is when they allow me to come and speak to them. I was ordered back at that time to Frankfurt, Germany, which was also a picture of what the Germans were capable of doing and had done. I was told to go into the IG Farben office building, which is a big sprawling building in Frankfurt, and it was recommended that I go up to the 3rd floor. And as I walked into the IG Farben building, I saw off to my right, in the lobby, 2 moving belts that were moving upward. And as the belts moved very slowly, a wooden platform would appear, and we could get on the platforms, and it would take us to upper floors, and we could get off wherever we wanted. And off to my left were 2 belts that were moving in the other direction, which would take us down. So I got onto one of these platforms and went up to the 3rd floor as someone had suggested. And when I got off on the 3rd floor, I saw 2 big oak doors, and I opened the doors and walked in, and here was this big rectangular room. And inside of this room was an oak desk around this whole room, like a racetrack, an oval racetrack. And on the right side, there were wooden steps where we could go up the steps and get onto the inside of the oval. And on the inside of the oval, there was a large printing type machine, and next to it was a large printing machine. And we obtained the entry code, and we punched the entry code into the type machine, into the keyboard, and the printer would immediately print up a menu which would contain a long listing of many things, and each item on the menu had a code. And we would punch the code into the keyboard of a particular item, and we would hear a low rumble. Everything under this oak wooden desk would start to rotate around the room, and would finally stop, and there were 2 panels that we would lift up, and here would be the files of what we were looking for, and we had punched in the key words that we took off the menu. This was the most unusual machine that I'd ever seen. It was actually a computer. It had everything in it except a memory. The memory was contained in all these files. I believe with the German ingenuity, if we would have given them time, they probably would have worked out a memory for this machine. But this is an indication of the creative abilities that the German population had. And when we would look at other things that they created, jet planes, they were way ahead of us on that, jet planes, rockets. In order to propel the jet planes and the rockets, which would create a tremendous amount of heat, they had to devise different types of alloys, metal alloys that could handle the heat, which they developed. Different fuels. Most unique society that could create all these things and still do the horrible things that they did. And they knew they were doing it. One of the things that I caution the Holocaust survivors that I take into schools is that I don't think it's quite fair enough to just go in and speak about the 6 million innocent Jews that were killed in these camps. Because in reality, there were 12 million innocent people murdered in these camps. Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, the low-cost labor that they brought in from Turkey. Like any industrial nation, they needed low-cost labor the way we need it now. And they were bringing in low-cost labor from Turkey, as I state. Why wouldn't they send the low-cost labor back? They no longer needed them because they could get all the slave labor that they wanted. Just go pick people up, put them to work. They refused to send the Turks back. They killed every one of them because of their skin color. Imagine condemning people to death because of the color of their skin, which is exactly what they did. They condemned Jehovah's Witnesses because Jehovah's Witnesses went around talking about peaceful solutions. There were 90 men of the cloth that were incarcerated in Dachau because they rose in their pulpits and preached against what was going on in their society. They were classified as political dissidents. The 90 men of the cloth were incarcerated in Dachau. Only 30 came out alive. That gives people an idea of who they were eliminating from their society and the reasons for it. There was no such thing as law and order. They made their own laws in Nuremberg. Another fact that is not publicized too much is what happened to these people after the termination of the war. We know about the Nuremberg trials where the top elements of the Nazi party were tried, most of whom were sentenced to be hung, put to death. What about the hundreds of others that were nothing more or less than criminals against society, human society? Dachau was established as another place to try these animals. There were 200 of these subhuman animals that were rounded up and tried in Dachau. And because we are a nation of law and order, in order to hold trials, we must have witnesses. We would send trucks out to pick up people and bring them in to witness these trials of these 200 animals. Out of the 200, 36 were sentenced to be hung. And again, being a nation of law and order, we were going to have witnesses for these hangings. Gallows were built in Dachau. By this time, the civilian population in the area knew what was going on, and when it came time for the hangings, they would say, "No, not me, I'm not going." Those people that resisted witnessing the hangings were put on the trucks anyway. Some of them got bent out of shape a little bit, but they went and witnessed the hangings. Another factor about this time period in history is that what about the survivors of these poor people that were incarcerated in these concentration camps? What happened to them? Nobody wanted them. They were told to go back where they came from. what were they going to go back to? Their families were butchered, destroyed. Whatever possessions they had were taken from them, were not going to be given back. What were they going to go back to? It was unfortunate that some of these camps had to be held open until 1953 to hold these survivors. Many of them stated they wanted to go to Israel, but Britain wouldn't allow that. So, until Harry Truman put his foot down and said, people of the world, you're going to take these people. Surprisingly enough, the first nation that said that they would take 35,000 survivors was Argentina. And I say surprisingly enough because Argentina was the fastest country that sided with the Germans. They took 35,000 of these survivors. You can just imagine parceling these people out amongst the nations of the world. Look at what the ones that came to the United States had to do. They had to learn a new language. They had to learn the structure of the American society, how they would fit in. They had to learn a new occupation, most of them. Most of them did learn. For example, one of the survivors that I take out became an accountant. A very, very capable accountant. She speaks 7 different languages. I have my survivors emphasize the strengths of our society because of the education that we offer our people, which is the biggest factor. We also emphasize the murder of the 12 million, not 6 billion Jews. What else do you want? Unfortunately, our generation is dying off rapidly, and how will this story continue? And we feel that it's essential that the story of the Holocaust be continued somehow. And that is one of the reasons why I picked up this film produced by Walter Cronkite, and I am distributing that film free of charge. So far, I've distributed by request only. So far, I've distributed over 80 of them to schools, and I have more requests coming in all the time. I'm thankful for that. As requests keep coming in, I will keep producing the film and still give them away free of charge.
You want to stop for a while? It's on. It's on.
After I retired and moved to Sun City, I got very tired of just wasting my time on a golf course and playing bridge, and I was looking for something to do. And I had heard about the Teaching Tolerance program, which was originated by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 1991. I wrote to them that I would have an interest in their program if they would send me some information. They never answered, but one day UPS dropped a large carton off by my front door, and I opened it up. Here's all the materials that Teaching Tolerance program makes available to school systems free of charge. And I had to plow through all this material and acquaint myself with it and try to get started, and I had no idea how to start. So I took a chance and called the Deer Valley school system, talked to the operator on the phone and told her what I was trying to do. I said, I know nothing about this program, and I would like to talk to someone about this program in your district office. So she finally put me on the phone with someone there, and I tried to explain to that someone on the phone about the program, and they were very curt. And I said, all I wanted is just a few minutes of your time. Maybe you can tell me if I'm just wasting my time trying to get this program started with the schools, or if it has some value. So she said, I'll give you 15 minutes on such and such a day. Well, I took the whole program up on that particular day, and she kept me waiting about 45 minutes. I finally went into her office with the program, and she very curtly said, well, what is it? I said, I am not trying to pretend that I know anything about educational processes or what this program is all about. I know nothing about it. All I want is your opinion. And I took out, the first thing was the package on hate in America. I handed her the package, and she looked at it, looked at the tape, looked at the book that came with it, and started to read all the things. There were 40 pages of material in there. And she looked up and said, "What else do you have?" And I handed her something else. That 15 minutes stretched out to 2 hours. When we finished, she said, "This material belongs at our schools. When can we get it?" So that's how I started. Teaching tolerance stresses the importance of what our society is all about. The United States is the largest melting pot the world has ever seen, and this is what our strength is. And this is the strength of the program of teaching tolerance, how to get along with each other, how not to teach about hate, as other educational societies in other parts of the world do. We teach our young people how they're going to progress in our society and give them the tools to work with. I then originated another phase of this program, and I call it Teaching Tolerance Conversations with Students. I started to call schools and offer this program to them, and it slowly gained momentum. I utilized my experiences during World War II with blinking.
It's okay, you got 5 minutes.
I utilized my experiences during World War II as part of my conversations, and I also utilized the experiences of Holocaust survivors. We emphasize the importance of the structure of our American society. We don't try to dwell on negatives. The program of conversations with students has mushroomed to such an extent that in 5 years I averaged between 40 to 50 school invitations per year. I'm trying to pull back a little bit from that because it's become too much of a strain. When I receive a call now from a school, I stress the fact that I want a large audience. As an example, just this past Thursday, I addressed 600 students at Greenway Middle School. When we finished, the principal, Mr. Acosta, came up to us and he stated, and he grabbed my hand and he said, "This is the most powerful, meaningful presentation we've ever had at our school." And that pleased me very much. I consider that my pay for my efforts. I have currently some appointments on my calendar up until May 20th. We continue to emphasize, primarily because of the tremendous mixture of our society here with the influx of the Chicanos, that they don't have to take a back seat to anybody. They can progress in our society if they want to, merely by education. Unfortunately, we have a problem in that area because their parents want to cling to their old culture. So these kids are exposed to two different cultures in every day of their lives. How are they going to swing? What direction are they going to take? Hopefully our message will assist them in becoming part of the American society and become firmly entrenched. I find that it is very satisfying to carry these messages to the young people in our school systems today. I'm very proud of the fact that I have spread the Teaching Tolerance program to well over 200 schools in the state of Arizona, stretching all the way from Flagstaff to Nogales, all the way from Yuma to Globe. I shall continue to promote the program as long as I possibly can.
Well, that's great. I think
Bravo! Ooh. One is unique.
I'm no different. Anybody can do this.
I got like 2 minutes.
In there?
It's on. I got you in. You
Oh,
bet.
it's on?
It's on. I got
Okay.
you in.
I'm Flory Freshman,
Yeah.
and this is my father George at his liberation photo from Dachau. It was taken in Garmisch, Germany, when he was rehabilitated from having TB. And this gentleman here, Jack, is one of his liberators. And here he is here with my stepmother. And in
Hold it like that. I want
New
to see
Year's
if I can.
Eve.
I'm going to get a close up. Oh. Okay, keep talking. I'm
New
sorry.
Year's Eve of last year, 2003. This is 2004 now, by the way. And it's my dad now. Here he was at age 19 when he was liberated. He was in the camp, different camps, working as a watchmaker, a forger, signature forger, whatever he could do, portrait painter. And he had the same uniform for all 5 years. And it was down to his ankles when he started. And now he actually grew on no food. Can you imagine? And he's like a clown. He loves to joke and clown around. And this, he married my mother, who is a survivor from Lodz, Poland, who is no longer with us. And I shot a video on that, Lisa Hubert. And so that's my mom. And
So it's all out. I'm out of.
that's it.